Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're going to try to make the most of our time this morning. We've got a very compelling topic. We've got a great crowd. Thank you all for coming out this morning. And you can chew as quietly as you can, but, that's okay. Want to welcome you all. Today's speakers, Deborah Goldberg of Earth Justice to my left, and Marion Rose of the Croton Watershed Clean Water Coalition to my right, will help us answer the question, is our drinking water at risk by drilling for gas in our region, in the Marcellus Shale? On behalf of the League, I'd like to thank Hector for hosting our breakfast today. Breakfast is $7. There's an envelope going around. If you haven't yet had the opportunity to make your payment, please do. Some people have mentioned that they haven't yet registered for League membership this year. It's $60. We'll send an email around again, and we'd be pleased to take your payment and have you be a member. What we'd like to do, and I'm following in the footsteps, and they're large footsteps, of Alice Bloom, is go around the room and have people introduce themselves. We've got, I know, a wonderful crowd of people. I recognize a lot of faces. Then what I'm going to do is give a very brief overview of the topic, introduce our speakers. We're very happy to have LMC-TV here today so that people who weren't able to make it can watch it at home. Our speakers will give a 10-minute presentation, and then afterward we're going to open it up to your questions. My only request is that you keep your questions brief, because this is not only for us, the goal here is to educate all of us and then take next steps. So without further delay, I'd like to go around the room. I'm going to actually pass this, we'll pass the microphone. You don't think the microphone? I'm going to ask our camera person, can you hear me? And should I pass the microphone around? Okay, we're going to do that. All right, so I'm going to go around the room, and then we'll have breakfast and we'll proceed.
I'm Carolyn Cunningham. I'm a League of Women Voters member from Rye, and I'm a member of Federated Conservationists of Westchester County, which is a local Westchester County. Sorry. It's on, but it's not working. A local Westchester County organization with a website, Federated Conservationists of Westchester County.
I'm Deirdre Corwin. I'm on the board of the Kemper Memorial Park and the St. John's Vestry.
Doris Block, I'm secretary of this chapter of the League.
Lois Hersberg, all I can say is I'm retired.
Alice Modell, formerly of Larchmont Now in Rye.
Peter Varley, a longtime water drinker.
Marilyn Varley, a resident of Mamaroneck.
Michelle Lewis, I'm an architect and principal of Lewis and Gould Architects.
Jean Perrone from Mamaroneck. I'm on the Committee for the Environment.
Please speak as loudly as you can. Even if this is going through to the camera, and I think the TV has it, we all also want to hear your comments.
Ernie Odiona, Councilman, Town of Mamaroneck.
Margaret Corbett, Treasurer of the League of Women Voters of Larchmont, Mamaroneck.
Ann Herman, past president of the League of Women Voters.
Elaine Chapnick, co-president of the local summit.
Mark Carell, Village of Mamaroneck, environmental engineer.
Hi, Marianne Sullivan, League of Women Voters, New York, interested in water.
This is the way we're taught to do it in politics. First, for everybody in the room, I'm George Latimer, State Assemblyman.
George Latimer, State Assemblyman.
And I also left for you a flyer on an upcoming budget hearing on February 18th and a copy of the Legislative Gazette. If you like that publication, we make them available through the local libraries.
Thank you. Alice Bloom. It's a pleasure to be here as a guest. We created this forum over 15 years ago, and I'm so glad it's flourishing. Thank you, Beth, for organizing today.
Jeremy Ingpen, Washingtonville Housing Alliance.
Miriam Cohen, New Rochelle branch, but I just moved to Larchmont.
I'm Marshall Case with the American Chestnut Foundation and Trust for Wildlife, and I came down from Vermont because our clean water finds its way down here.
I'm Sarah Evans, the Committee for the Environment of the Village of Amerenik and the League.
Marie Venezia, Executive Director of Sheldrake Environmental Center and member of the League in Scarsdale.
Lynn Reichgott, member of the League and president of At Home on the Sound.
Glenna Gray, concerned taxpayer.
Elizabeth Sanger, Environmental Advocates of New York and also Earth Justice.
Robert Sanger, Mamaroneck resident.
Thank you all very much. Want to recap for something that happened at last year's forum called Carbon, Bigfoot, and You. That was also televised on LMC-TV. And for those of you who either attended or saw this, you'll recall that our guest speaker, Marshall Case, who's here with us today, President Emeritus of the American Chestnut Foundation and President of the Trust for Wildlife, was discussing the benefits of coffee grown in the shade to the climate and wildlife, including migrating songbirds who serenade us in our backyards. Today you are drinking Trust for Wildlife's hummingbird shade-grown coffee, 100% shade-grown. It's from Nicaragua. The League is always interested in educating people about how to take positive steps. And last year we discussed this and said next year we would actually have coffee. And this is an example of shade-grown coffee, 100%. You actually have to ask for it. Surprisingly, even for many of the environmental organizations that are selling it, it may be fair trade, it may only be a percentage. And the reason why this is important is because sun-grown coffee is a large contributor to the climate problem that we have. Just a few very quick facts. Coffee is our largest imported food crop, and while statistics vary, we consume between 1/5 and 1/3 of the world's coffee. 35 of the 50 countries with the most extensive deforestation challenges are coffee-growing countries. And if you're a coffee drinker, we hope that you will consider shifting your coffee drinking because every cup counts. If you consider that we're cutting down trees to plant coffee in the shade, and this is not all that dissimilar to the topic today. What we do here affects people elsewhere, and it affects the wildlife. When we take down the trees, the birds have no place to live. We have to use chemicals instead of birds to eat the bugs. It causes erosion problems, and obviously it heats the climate because there are no trees to cool the climate. So we've already introduced ourselves, and now what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of the topic that we're here to hear about today, namely Marcellus Shale. The Marcellus Shale is an underground layer of rock spanning approximately 600 miles, covering roughly 54,000 square miles in western New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. It's a potentially valuable source of natural gas for natural gas companies and much, much needed income for the economically challenged property owners in upstate New York. Property owners in upstate New York have formed coalitions and hired attorneys to assist them in negotiating the best financial deals while also taking steps to protect their property by getting the gas companies to provide indemnification against property contamination or loss. So people upstate are looking to their attorneys to protect their interest and are looking to the companies to indemnify them if there are any problems. So for many upstate property owners, this drilling symbolizes the golden goose. For upstate and other downstate residents, it presents a threat to environmental and human health. Drilling has begun in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and reports of resulting water contamination are now on record. New York, through the Department of Environmental Conservation, with critical input from environmental conservation groups such as Earth Justice and the Croton Watershed Clean Water Coalition, Natural Resources Defense Council, and many others, continues to evaluate issues surrounding the gas drilling extraction methods called hydrofracking, including the quantities of water used and related disposal methods for the unusable radioactive sludge byproduct, the risk resulting from chemicals used in hydrofracking process, and related disposal methods for the unusable radioactive sludge. And our speakers will talk more about this and what those chemicals are. Of major concern is what impact all of this has on our drinking water supply. According to the NRDC, 1 million acres of the Marcellus Shale are in New York City watershed posing, or the New York City water supply, posing a threat to the drinking water of approximately 9 million people, including us. I'm now going to introduce first Marion Rose, and then I'll introduce Deborah Goldberg. And again, I want to thank LMC-TV for taping this. Marion Rose is a member of the Town of Bedford Conservation Advisory Board. She was a founding member and president of the Croton Watershed Clean Water Coalition. She's its president emeritus and is on the board of directors. She's worked with the Sierra Club in a variety of capacities. Her present work includes introducing legislation at the state level to better protect forests in New York State, protect the sources of water for New York City's Croton system that supplies 10% to 30% of our water. She works with New York City groups to prevent the rapid rise in New York City water rates, educates the public through newsletters, and participates in summer greening programs with middle schools. She is opposed to drilling for natural gas in New York City, and she's participating with other groups to prevent the extraction. Marion attended Barnard College and got her master's in physics from Columbia and her PhD from Harvard University. And worked on the Manhattan Project from 1942 to 43, has taught in physics at Harvard University, and has worked for peaceful application of nuclear fusion, and has been a visiting fellow at Yale University. It's my pleasure to introduce Marion Rose.
No, this is fine.
Is this okay?
Can you hear me? Okay. First, I want to thank the League for inviting me. I find it a great honor to be able to speak to you. I always admired very much the work you do. It's always been very useful work, very intelligent work, and I really appreciate what you do, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to say a couple of words about who we are. Our main focus as a not-for-profit group is to protect source water. We believe that the water here in this area, we are so blessed with wonderful, clean, potable water, and it should be protected at the source. That's the best way and the least expensive way to provide good drinking water, and therefore we oppose this idea to drill in the Marcellus Shale, because we fear, even with all the precautions they can take, that the water will be eventually polluted, and I'll give you the reasons why later on. Very quickly, why are we concerned about here in Mamaroneck or in the Croton watershed about drilling on the west side of the Hudson? Well, the reason is quite obvious. Most of us drink water from the west side of the Hudson. If you want to pass around these maps, it'll show you very clearly what happens. The water we drink in Mamaroneck comes here from two gigantic aqueducts, the Catskill and the Delaware Aqueduct, that carries water from west of Hudson here. And here in Mamaroneck, there's a filtration plant being built right down the road if you want to go visit. So our water that we drink here in Westchester is very dependent on what happens in the west of Hudson in the Marcellus Shale. I'd like to give you a very brief. This map shows you where in the Westchester County who drinks which water from which aqueduct, and it'll give you an idea how dependent we are on what happens there on the west of Hudson. Now, what is hydrofracturing? It's a fairly new technique for extracting natural gas from the ground. Previously, they extracted natural gas just by drilling a well straight down and sort of sucking up the natural gas. But as those layers of natural gas got used up, they had to drill further and further down into another part of the shale. They drilled down to 6,000, 8,000 feet. And the newest technique is after you drill down, then you go horizontally. In other words, perpendicular to your well, you go horizontally. And so you are going right into the shale, and so you can collect a lot more natural gas that way. What they do then is to pump water under tremendously high pressure with chemicals in it, including sand and chemicals, and we don't know what those chemicals are, not all of them at any rate. And this gets pushed down into this well. There are holes drilled in the horizontal section. The water comes out at tremendous pressure and opens up the fissures in the shale. And the natural gas then percolates back into the well and comes and is extracted. Here's some pictures of how it's done. I always think one picture is worth 1,000 words. And it takes a tremendous amount of water. Millions of gallons of water has to be pumped down into this well. Where do you get the water from? They extract it from the local aquifer, or they have to cart it in via trucks from wherever they can get the water. So there's a huge amount of trucks going back and forth from these drilling pads. These drilling pads are anywhere from 40 acres to a square mile, depending how many wells they use at one drilling pad. So the areas where these drilling pads occur are absolutely devastated. There are trucks going back and forth. There's a lot of storage of fluid that comes back. And this gives you an idea of what it's like, what it looks like. This is a drilling pad right in the middle of a forest. The next picture I'd like to show you is the Marcellus Shale here in New York State. It could be better, but you'll notice here in the corner there's a sort of very light green area. Now that is the New York City watershed where we get our drinking water, and it's right in the middle, right there in the Marcellus Shale. So we could be profoundly affected by what goes on. They talk about the companies who are doing this, of course, say not to worry. The water will not be affected. The surrounding landscape will not be affected. But I think the pictures show what will happen. One thing, for instance, they say the access roads where these huge trucks by the hundreds come along and are going to be very narrow. But when you see these pictures of the access roads, you see that the sides of the roads have been denuded also. The road itself might be narrow, but all the trees around the roads have been cut down. Do I have a little more time? The state prepared what's called a draft supplemental environmental impact statement. Was prepared by the New York State DEC, quote, to satisfy the requirements of the State Environmental Quality Review Act for most of these anticipated operations. And it's a horrendous document of 803 pages or more, very poorly done, and thank goodness we got people who are very well equipped to read this and went through the whole thing, and we're terribly grateful for what you did. I went to a round table about 6 weeks ago that was held by Senator Antoine Thompson, who's chair of the New York State Committee on Environment. And former DEP Commissioner Al Appleton described this document that I've just talked about as the worst EIS he has ever seen. Those were his exact words. And at that round table, there was a representative of the League of Women Voters who stated she asked the DEC to develop strict regulations instead of just relying on environmental impact statements for each drilling, to increase the staff for DEC, because the DEC is so severely understaffed that they can't possibly be on top of every application, and also to draft an entirely new GEIS. So your League of Women Voters representative up there was very much against this document. The problems with this GIS, the water supply, you need millions and millions of gallons of water, clean water, that could be drinking water. One of the very biggest problems is the quality of the flowback water. In other words, a lot of the water comes back out of the well, and it's contaminated with all kinds of chemicals. Not only the chemicals that they put in, and we don't really know what they are, but as you go down 7,000 feet into the ground, what you hit ancient layers that were put down billions of years ago, ancient seas that dried up and formed these shale layers, and nobody really knows what's in there, and a lot of that stuff gets picked up and flows back with the water. It's called product water, and as you mentioned, there's radioactive material in there. You really don't know what you're going to get. Unfortunately, there's something known as the Halliburton loophole that was introduced under the Bush administration, and it exempts the EPA. It means that the EPA really has no control of what's going on. They're not told what the chemicals are, although now we're beginning to know what they are. But they're trade secrets. We don't know all the combinations of the chemicals. So I always compare that to TNT. I mean, if you analyze TNT, each chemical that goes into it, it can be quite harmless, but when you combine them, boom, and, you know. So they don't tell us that. They will not tell you of the cumulative environmental impacts, which is, they don't tell you. They'll tell you what one well will do, but they won't tell you what 1,000 wells will do. They say they can't, it's too much, they don't know. So then our reaction to that is, well, if you don't know what's going to happen, don't do it. It's known as the precautionary principle. There are many gaps in this environmental impact statement, as far as I could tell, but I'm sure Deborah knows a lot more. They don't really discuss the impact on the workers who work there. The air quality at those pads is very poor, and it's so bad that they don't know really how to deal with it. So what they do, they put a fence around the whole area, and they say, stay away. You know, they tell the public, don't come too close because the air quality is so bad. But I don't know what they do for the workers' health. Also, the impacts on wildlife are not really discussed. There are endangered species like the Indiana bat. The New York State has no laws restricting the amount of water that you can extract from the ground. That's something we've been fighting for unsuccessfully. They don't tell you how to safely dispose of the flowback that can be full of these chemicals that nobody really knows what they are. What are you going to do with them? Give them to a sewage treatment plant? They're not equipped. They're not equipped to deal with this. And they don't even know what they're dealing with. So one solution is to dig a deep hole somewhere appropriate, and you just put this stuff in the hole and hope for the best. But there's really no solution to what you do with the water that comes back. It's a very serious problem. the governor is attempting to streamline the whole process because he's desperate for money, as we all know. And he even issued an executive order number 25 trying to streamline secret, in other words, make the process much quicker, sort of smooth over the difficult parts. And of course, we're totally against that, and even brought out an article on that. And but for Croton Watershed Clean Water Coalition, we're trying so hard to protect the forests in this area. We have wonderful forests. 75% of our watershed is forested, and that is one of the very, very main reasons why we have such good water. And there's no question but that this drilling, even if they did it most carefully, is going to impact the forests because it's going to cut them up, it's going to destroy the forest's ability to survive. If you cut them up, if you fragment the forest too much, they're not going to really survive. There'll be invasive species, all kinds of invasive species, and the landscape will be transformed from a beautiful forested landscape that we all know and we all love. It'll just become a bleak industrial landscape. And without the trees, even if they drill and there's no, if they drill most carefully and the wells don't get impacted from the drilling, the very fact that you're going to lose the forest will have a major impact on the water quality. So again, they can say what they like about the drilling. We're going to lose our forests, and that in itself will be sufficient to degrade water quality. So I think by now you get our point. We're against this. There should be a total ban in the Marcellus Shale, as far as we're concerned, in all of New York State. Thank you.
Very much. I do want to say that our speakers today are looking at, we're looking at critical issues, and the League, generally likes to be able to provide a balanced view of things. And I will confess that our program today is really looking at the challenges. And there's certainly, I would hope, can be ways, if we act very deliberatively, might be able to find a way to be able to make this work. There are obviously people upstate who are clamoring for some kind of, economic payback for property that they own. And so that if people can put their heads together, I know Cornell University is working on this and a number of other very reputable organizations and learning institutions to get it right. So this presentation is really one piece of an analysis, and the goal is for those of us to leave here and understand that we live in a state where we may have differing views, and the hope is that we can find a solution that balances the interests. However, our drinking water supply, of course, is a critical consideration. Now going to introduce Deborah Goldberg, who is the managing attorney of Earth Justice's Northeast Regional Office, which conducts legal advocacy and litigation related to global warming and environmental health. Since her arrival at Earth Justice in July 2008, Deborah has been combating the environmental degradation likely to be caused by gas development in the Marcellus Shale. Ms. Goldberg spent the first decade of her legal career in private practice, concentrating on cases involving environmental impact review, historic preservation, and hazardous waste. Following graduation from Harvard Law School in 1986, Deborah served as a law clerk from the then Judge Stephen Breyer and the First Circuit Court of Appeals and the late Constance Baker Motley of the Southern District of New York. Before joining Earth Justice, Deborah was the Democracy Program Director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, where she gained her appreciation of the League of Women Voters. And Ms. Goldberg also holds a PhD in philosophy and taught ethics for 3 years at Columbia University. It's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Goldberg.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be in a room full of environmental leaders and engaged citizens. It's really important that people do educate themselves, but once you're educated, we also need you to act. And my respect for the League comes from the fact that I know that the League members are people who act. And the League has huge public credibility, so when you speak out, people will listen to you. When I was at the Brennan Center, we always wanted the League to be our lead plaintiff because we knew that it would give credibility to our lawsuits if the League were up there as the named plaintiff. I'm currently at Earth Justice, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what we are doing with respect to the gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale. We are working in both Pennsylvania and in New York, and I want to start by talking a little bit about Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania, to its detriment, is now serving more or less as the guinea pig for what we can expect here in New York. We are learning from them what happens if you proceed full speed ahead without considering the environmental consequences. And in particular, we are seeing already impacts on drinking water supplies and aquatic resources because of the gas drilling in Pennsylvania. There are a range of problems that we have already seen with respect to water supplies. In some cases, we've seen gas migration into groundwater from poorly cemented and encased well bores. People are able to pour their water into a jug, shake it up, and light it. And there are people across the country who have been in gas drilling areas where there's been migration into groundwater who can turn on their faucets and light them on fire. We've also seen problems from spills of the fracturing fluids, of diesel fuel, the machinery that we're talking about that's needed in order to drill down 6,000 to 8,000 feet and then horizontally for another 3,000 to 4,000 feet is heavy-duty machinery. It runs on diesel fuel. And the trucks that truck in the millions of gallons of water that are needed for every single well also run on diesel fuel. So there's lots of fuel storage that goes on these pads, and of course there's lots of fuel burning that goes on as we try to extract the natural gas. In addition, as Marion mentioned, the wastewater that is produced from the drilling and the fracturing processes is highly toxic. We get waste at every stage of production. When they drill the well, they use something called drilling muds, which are fluids that help to provide additional friction as they go down. They're typically barite compounds that have high levels of mercury. And in most states these days, those compounds go into a pit and eventually are buried on site. In the DEIS that was done for the gas drilling, there is no mention of what is in the drilling muds. The hydraulic fracturing process, as was mentioned earlier, uses a wide array of toxic chemicals that are mixed into these millions of gallons of clean water. They are injected at high pressure and they come back with very heavy levels of salts, total dissolved solids from those seabeds that were buried and are now dissolved into the waters that are injected. They come back with heavy metals, such as arsenic and lead and selenium. And they often come back with normally occurring radioactive materials known as norm, which can build up on the equipment, which later needs to be disposed of as do the wastes, and also go into the waters that then need to be disposed of. In Pittsburgh area, these gas wastes were sent to publicly owned treatment works, POTW, they're sewage plants. And immediately we began to see elevated levels of total dissolved solids in the Monongahela River, which is the drinking water supply for 350,000 people. The Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania had to play catch-up. They sent letters out to all of the sewage treatment plants telling them that they could not take more than 1% of their influent from the gas drilling wastes to ensure that if it were not going to be treated, which it is not in a sewage treatment plant, it would at least be thoroughly diluted before it was then put into the drinking water supply. The state of Pennsylvania figured out fairly quickly that if the industry continued to drill at the rate they were predicting, and the wastewaters that they were producing continued to be generated at the rates that they were being produced at that time, they would impair every single freshwater stream in the entire state in a period of 2 years. The salt levels are so high that they have contributed to water quality impairments in drinking water supplies and in major diverse ecosystems. We've seen the death of an entire 40-mile stretch of Dunkard Creek. Everything in it was killed. It may not have been exclusively from the gas wastewaters, but we have good reason to believe that they were the tipping point. And even if they were not involved, the golden algae that killed these came from the southwest, and it is believed that it hitchhiked on drilling equipment up into the northeast, where it is now an invasive species in our streams. Pennsylvania is now proposing a number of changes to its regulations to protect its waters going forward. It is proposing new casing regulations to prevent the gas migration, and it is proposing new regulations to limit the amount of total dissolved solids that any wastewater treatment plant can discharge into a surface body of surface water. Needless to say, this is a little bit late in coming, but certainly it's better than nothing at all. It is having the effect of forcing the industry to rethink how it works, which is very important. And one of the things that is happening is that we're beginning to see additional moves toward recycling of the fracturing wastewaters. Whereas before they would go out and withdraw millions of clean water, pollute it, and have nowhere to put it, they are now realizing that if they can't bring it even to an industrial treatment plant, because it cannot be discharged with the high levels of total dissolved solids, that they have to figure out a way of treating and reusing it. And so we're starting to hear reports of recycling on site. Unfortunately, that recycling does not appear to be under the regulatory control of any authority, federal or state, so that may be the next front in the regulatory battle. But at the very least, we are seeing some facilities that are zero discharge facilities, meaning what they will do is take the wastewater, treat it, take the effluent that is relatively clean and send it back to the companies to be reused in drilling, and take the residual waste that have been taken out of the water and send it to an appropriate facility for the disposal of the waste. In New York, we are learning from this process. The state is in the middle of an environmental review process. The draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement was released in September. Comments were completed by the end of December, and the agency is now in the process of responding to those comments before it reissues the environmental impact statement. Our hope is that the document will be very substantially revised because it was very seriously deficient. And if it is seriously revised, our view is that under the law they are required to resubmit it for public review. It is not sufficient simply to make huge additions or major revisions and finalize the document. The purpose of the State Environmental Quality Review Act is to ensure that the public understands what the impacts are going to be. So if there are changes, we should get a second chance for review. Unfortunately, I'm skeptical that this is going to happen. I expect that the final environmental impact statement will be the next document that we see. It will be published in the Environmental Notice Bulletin, and I expect that 10 days later we will see the findings and the process will be over. At that point, if there are still serious deficiencies in the document, you can expect to see some litigation. We fully expect that if there are not methods for dealing with the potential impacts to the New York City watershed, including potentially simply setting it off limits to drilling, including around the infrastructure areas, that the City of New York may very well sue. Certainly, if we do not see major improvements in the analysis, and I'll talk about some of the particular types of analysis that we'd like to see improved, you can expect that environmental organizations that have participated in this process also will sue. The particular concerns that we have, which were mentioned briefly earlier, are the following. Under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, the Department of Environmental Conservation is supposed to be evaluating the cumulative impacts of this gas drilling process. Instead, what they have done is evaluate the impacts of a single well. They have refused to make any kind of prediction about how many wells there will be, at what rate they will be developed, even though they are more than happy to make pronouncements about how much money they're likely to come into the revenue stream. So our view is that just because it may be difficult to predict does not mean that it is impossible to predict. Certainly, the gas companies are making those predictions. They are investing on the basis of those predictions. We can see how fast things developed in Pennsylvania. We have no reason to believe that it will be any different in New York unless there are some controls put in place. And the agency needs to use its best judgment to estimate what the cumulative impacts will be. That cumulative impact analysis needs to include secondary impacts, additional development that is the product of the gas drilling. For example, we are going to need new wastewater treatment plants. There are no industrial wastewater treatment plants in the entire state of New York that are authorized to take this wastewater. They will either build them here, or they will build them somewhere else, or they will be trucking this wastewater hundreds of miles away in order to dispose of it in other states. There will be service facilities built in the state. Already in the town of Horseheads, there's a proposal by Schlumberger, which is one of the major service companies, to build a major facility that will serve a 300-mile radius. It is not being subject to an environmental impact statement. It is in litigation right now in order to compel that analysis. That is something that certainly, if it's not evaluated independently, must be evaluated in the environmental impact statement for the gas drilling. And it is nowhere to be found, except in a section talking about the great economic development benefits that will come from the gas drilling. There's a very poor analysis of the alternatives to this process. We have asked them to consider off-limit areas. We've asked them to consider doing a planned phased development so we can understand exactly how much will be proceeding at what time and at what pace. And again, the agency just begged off and asserted that it was too difficult for it to predict. There are a wide variety of environmental impacts that we believe have been inadequately reviewed. There is effectively no traffic analysis whatsoever in the document. All they talk about is the fact that local communities will be in a position to establish road use agreements with the companies. But we are talking about potentially 1,350 truck trips for every well. And that is over rural roads that are by no means used to seeing this kind of traffic. These are huge tractor-trailer trucks, and those roads are not built for the weight of a truck filled with millions of gallons of water. So we need a serious traffic analysis that will evaluate the congestion that people will see and the impacts on their communities. In addition, there's an extraordinarily deficient air quality analysis. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where there is another shale deposit called the Barnett Shale, there has been drilling for some time, and there are thousands of wells that have been drilled very close to the city and indeed within the city limits. A recent air quality analysis there figured out that because of the oil and gas development in that area, they have doubled the air emissions in the entire 5-county Dallas-Fort Worth area. The gas drilling emissions are the equivalent of every single car on the road in that metropolitan area. As a result, Fort Worth right now is taking a look at the possibility that they should slow down the development because these air emissions are extremely detrimental to people's health. We're talking about respiratory diseases, we're talking about cardiovascular diseases, and we're talking about ozone impacts that also contribute to childhood asthma. In Wyoming, which is a wide open space for the most part, there are lots and lots of gas wells, and the governor of Wyoming, who is by no means a flaming liberal, has recently admitted that they are now in non-attainment in Wyoming, parts of Wyoming, for ozone. The environmental impact statement draft contains no evaluation of ozone impacts for New York. So we expect to see a better analysis in the next draft. We've mentioned the water quality impacts. In the draft environmental impact statement, what we see is a lengthy list of sewage treatment plants with pretreatment procedures. The agency does not point out the fact that all but 3 of them are unauthorized to receive any industrial influent. So we need a serious disclosure document that actually predicts what the wastewater needs will be and gives us a plan for dealing with the wastewater before it's generated. We do not need to replicate what we have just seen in Pittsburgh, where they have put no hold on the drilling and have no idea what to do with the waste. Finally, just quickly, there are noise impacts. The machinery is extremely loud. The compressor stations create 24-hour vibrations and noise for nearby residents, which affects wildlife as well. There are wildlife impacts that have not been analyzed. This is a supplemental generic statement. All it is doing is analyzing additional impacts from the Marcellus Shale. The original analysis dates back to 1992, and this draft does not recognize that there's been any change in the ecosystems of this state since that time. So those are the substantive concerns that we have with the draft environmental impact statement. One additional concern that we have is that the measures that DEC is proposing to mitigate all the potentially significant impacts are simply permit conditions for the drillers. They are proposing to require in individual permits that the drillers comply with conditions that will mitigate the impacts. But permit conditions are discretionary with the agency. They are putting themselves in a position to be lobbied by every company that comes to them for a drilling permit for exceptions from the conditions. And the only way that the public will be able to monitor this is to wait until the permit is actually issued and then frantically submit a Freedom of Information request to review the permit terms and find out whether or not they are adequate. That is no way to be proceeding in the state of New York. We need regulations, formal, clear, enforceable, consistent regulations that will provide an environmental bottom line for everybody who drills, so that we know the minimum requirements for anybody who wants to develop gas in this state. If the DEC wants to add additional permit conditions where there are additional significant impacts likely because of the location of a particular well, that is not only appropriate but desirable. But they should not be using the permit conditions exclusively as a way of regulating an entire industry. So where do we go from here? As I said, we're waiting for the response to comments. We're waiting for the next draft or final environmental impact statement to be published. We will review it carefully, and we will make an assessment about whether or not there's a need for litigation at that time. In the meantime, there are also potential legislative measures that could address some of these concerns. One of the things that Marion mentioned is that the state of New York actually does not give the Department of Environmental Conservation authority to regulate the withdrawal of water. That means that companies can just go down to any stream and withdraw as much as they can take out, unless they're in the Delaware River Basin watershed or the Susquehanna River Basin watershed or somewhere where there is a multi-state compact agency that actually regulates the withdrawals. Here in New York, the only requirement is a requirement that the amounts over a certain threshold be reported. But we need to make sure that our waters can be protected not only in quality but also in quantity. And of course, those two things are closely related. There have been streams in Pennsylvania that have been drained dry. And that means, you know, everything living in them no longer has a habitat. We should not let that happen here. And there will be other bills as well that you should be looking for in the legislature as we go forward. The state law is extremely important because we're working in a really deficient federal statutory framework. The oil and gas industry has been extremely successful in getting itself excluded from or exempt from most of the major environmental laws that govern other industries. It is not subject to the laws that govern hazardous waste. It is not subject to major provisions of the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. It has exemptions from provisions of the Clean Air Act and the Community Right to Know Act. So we are facing principally state law and state regulations, and we have a patchwork now of state provisions all over the country that we're dealing with. There is a bill pending in Congress right now, the Fracturing Responsibility and Awareness of Chemicals Act, FRAC Act, that would close the safe drinking water loophole and would also compel the industry to disclose all of the chemicals that it's using. Right now, the industry is disclosing what it's using to the Department of Environmental Conservation. The Department of Environmental Conservation has provided us with a laundry list of about 260 chemicals that might be used by the industry. But we do not know which ones actually are being used by the industry at any particular site. And that means that landowners are in no position to protect themselves because they are not going to be able to afford to test for 260 different chemicals in order to get a baseline understanding of the cleanliness of their water. And if they don't have a baseline test, they can't prove that the gas industry has polluted their water. So we need much better disclosure provisions, and that's something else that could be addressed by state law. Finally, I just want to mention that the Environmental Protection Agency is doing some studies of this process. We are hoping that there will be a fully funded study of the fracturing process. They are proposing to do a study of coal bed methane, which is also extracted with fracturing. We are going to be encouraging them to include all means of gas development, including gas development in shale. There are comments due on that proposal on February 26th. We'll be circulating a letter, and we'd be very pleased to have the League sign on. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions I want to ask. We're nearing the end of this. I want people to be able to go home today with an idea of how we can stay in touch and how we can access information. We've got a lot of great legislation on the books in this state, and what often happens is because of budget cuts, we're unable to enforce those laws. So one question I'm going to direct to Deborah. I'm actually going to direct two questions, one to Deborah and then to both of our speakers, is with respect to the fact that you're saying New York State is the place that we have to focus, and we've got George Latimer here, who can go back up to Albany, who's going to have a formidable challenge because obviously we've got downstate and upstate. But let's say we do get good regulations in place and we need them to be enforced. We have a DEC that has a very streamlined staff. What do we do to make sure that we're protecting our drinking water?
Well, that's a very good question. And you know, certainly as a litigator, one of the things I would like to see is a provision in whatever bills that we have that will enable us to do citizen enforcement actions. One of the ways that we are able to keep environmental agencies honest is by suing them when they don't do their job. And here in New York, it is not easy to do that because we don't have a citizen suit provision, and we would certainly like to see that. There are also, watchdog monitoring group, programs. We need eyes on the ground. Organizing people who can observe what's happening in their communities is very important. Region 3 of EPA has actually recently instituted a tip line. It's a hotline that people can call in to if they believe there is illegal activity going on around the dumping. I don't know whether that hotline is also going to serve New York. Region 3 does not cover New York. Region 2 covers New York. So we might want to ask Region 2 to follow the lead of Region 3 once the drilling starts going so that we can get immediate reporting of suspicious activity. And there is a lot of suspicious activity in Pennsylvania right now because the drilling is proceeding full speed ahead when there's no place to put the wastewater, and that water is going somewhere we know not exactly where. So those are two things I think that would be very helpful to have, a reporting device and a citizen suit provision.
Thank you. Marion, was there anything you wanted to say before we...
No, just make our point that no matter what precautions they take, and obviously it was very compelling what you had to say, but even if they were able to clean up their act, here in New York State, we feel there should be no drilling in the Marcellus for the reason I gave is that they'll destroy the forests, and even with the cleanest possible drilling, if you destroy the forests, you're going to destroy your drinking water. And as far as we're concerned, that is the most important consideration. Without water, there's no life.
I want to thank you all very much for coming, and if I have updated information that I get from Marion and Deborah or otherwise, the League will get it out to you. If you have any questions that you want answers to that you don't think were answered today, please let me know, and I'll be happy to get some information together and get it back out to you. And please, anybody who's interested, please do speak, because in mirroring what our speakers have said, we are an active, educated group of people and people listening at home. The only way we can affect change is if we actually take the next step. So I'm asking you, please, we are very, very busy people, but this is our drinking water supply that we're talking about. This is the basis of all life, and if there's a next step that can be taken, I ask you please to do so. Thanks very much.